Hi everyone, welcome to the What, Why, When podcast from Oxford University. My name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics and what is known as the Access Fellow at Jesus College, Oxford, and I'm delighted to be here with...
I'm Angus McIntyre. I'm studying first-year student studying politics, philosophy and economics.
Fantastic. So, Angus, what we're going to do in this podcast, as ever, is I'm going to ask you some random questions and we're trying to figure out a puzzle exactly in the same way that an Oxford tutorial will work. You've had a year of Oxford tutorial, so you roughly know how it works, but our audience hopefully will get to try it out for the first time. So, James Bond, are you a fan? What do you think?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
That's resolute. So, yeah, I also like a bit of a James Bond film because it's slightly fantastical, it's a bit absurd sometimes, the extent of his capabilities. But one thing that's always stuck in my mind a little bit, and I wanted to figure out, was whether or not there are people with a license to kill. That's one of the more famous attributes of James Bond. And indeed, I kind of wanted to delve into the concept of why a state would license its operatives to commit murder, effectively, and whether there's any sense in that whatsoever. So I suppose we ought to sort of start kind of conceptually and figure out where rules and norms and morality comes from. So there's a bit of a debate in law, typically, but it's also in philosophy and politics, as to whether or not humans make morality and then write it down. That's what we would call positive law. Versus morality exists independently of us and we discover it through reason and argumentation and so on. And that's what's called natural law. And it doesn't necessarily need to come from, say, our natures and how we sort of best stabilize our populations, but could come from religion and other sources like that. It could come from divine inspiration. So it's a big argument, it's a big question. But in terms of whether or not basically we make up all of our morality and write it down, or whether we find it in the world, do you have a view either way?
I think there's a slightly instinctual, certainly human attribute to avoid harm. Mm-hmm. I think humans in their interactions, I guess, get feedback from the world through pain and pleasure or something to the opposite of pain. And I think there's sort of a natural feedback loop that in a lot of cases, certainly individuals acting for themselves will act to sort of minimise their pain and maximise their pleasure or happiness somewhat. Mm-hmm. I think, so I guess that's received from sort of natural interaction or the way our brains and bodies have been wired. And I think you see that in the animal world too. And previously to humans, it's sort of a long-standing trend. But I think there's certainly an element of moving from being self-serving or acting in your own best interests to functioning in a community. There's some law and norms that have come about not because they're for the best interest of the actor or serve them in some way, but in fact are sort of artificially imposed because you need something to govern the interactions between humans so they can live in some harmonious way. Right. And I think if it was acceptable for everyone to go around being violent whenever they didn't get their way or in order to achieve their own personal short-term goals, there'd be no long-serving or fruitful life for anyone.
Right. I think that's really interesting because I suppose sometimes philosophers in the past have suspected that human nature is savage and violent, and that's our default, and that therefore law needs to step in to stop us behaving like that. And so a special class of individuals may be given a license to act violently, but otherwise the rest of us need to be tamped down. But from what you're saying, you seem to be suggesting that actually maybe human nature isn't so sort of instinctively violent. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think, I know there's a variety of literature in both directions, but I think you can make quite a strong argument that humans, at least now, and for the last quite a few thousand years, are socialised creatures or beings, and actually assuming that in the absence of any law, we turn immediately to violence, or what gets thrown around a lot as savagery. I think isn't correct, because I mean you can see this when in lots of examples of people being taken out of society for whatever reason and not being socialized for a temporary period of time, and it really changes the way they're sort of, it really deeply, profoundly affects people in a negative way. I think I do. I think certainly now humans are at least somewhat a socialized sort of class of person of.
Well, indeed, potentially socialized, but there's also some evidence that also default good, even absent that sort of socialization. So there was an interesting case where some young boys were marooned on a desert island off Fiji, slightly reminiscent, well, not slightly reminiscent, very reminiscent of what happens in Lord of the Flies, if you've ever read that book. In Lord of the Flies, they all just supposedly revert to their instinctual natures and they start killing each other. But in the real scenario, where there was this group of teenage boys, they did no such thing. They all cared after each other. There was one of the young boys broke his leg and was nursed back to health, and they were found safe and well only a couple of years later. So there is a hot debate on this, but it does seem like quite a lot of the evidence suggests that human nature is not necessarily quite so dark and violent as I think some philosophers have perhaps suggested in the past. So I suppose what becomes interesting is, when rulers start giving out laws on what can and cannot be done in terms of lethal force, so the killing of citizens. And I suppose one of the aspects of what rulers would have taken for granted is that they had a right to take the lives of their subjects. Up until fairly recently, that would have been considered so obvious as to not be worth even writing down. So they probably would have seen that as part of natural law. So one of the oldest codes of law is called the Code of Hammurabi, which is from the Babylonian Empire. And it's from about 1750 BCE, so we're talking sort of a good nearly 4,000 years ago. And in that, it contains what we would call the lex talionis, which is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So if someone commits some sort of crime, the state is entitled to mete out the same crime on them. And it was taken for granted that Hammurabi and his authority could just take the life of any subject they wanted to. And so this sort of gets into the nature of kingship and statecraft and stuff like this. I mean, what's your view on the view that some hold that a state is ultimately just a monopoly on violence? This is a view that was put out by Max Weber about 100 years ago. That if ultimately you want to understand why there are states at all, it is that some individuals within a territory have the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence in that area. Do you think that's a reasonable definition of state power?
I think it is, at least to an extent. For reasons of, well, without trying to come up with an answer of why there have been conflicts for the last many years.
Sure.
I think there are certainly situations where some sort of force has been required to legitimately defend interests, often territorial. I think perhaps that's clearer than if states are acting to defend economic interests or something. I think there's a distinction there. And that force has to rest somewhere. And I guess there's a strong argument to be made that having that force rest with a state is more organised and more legitimate in a way than if there was a collection of individuals and there was the private militia of the south of England, the private militia of the north of England, and who ultimately probably also represent slightly differing interests. And if you have that on a larger scale, you have a strong risk that these interests are going to conflict.
Right.
And then you move away from a legitimate defence of something to a more problematic conflict, I guess.
Yeah. Well, we see that playing out in history, right? I mean, Alfred the Great literally brought together the different parts of early England. So there was kind of a militia of the south of England and a militia of the north of England. And as you say, to make that more stable and peaceful, it was it was worth coming together. So I suppose when it comes to a license to kill in James Bond, then we've got this idea that states might have a legitimate use of violence within their territories for peace and order and stability, but they can also delegate that capacity for violence to their operatives, like James Bond. But this is nothing new, right? So the 12 tables of the Roman Empire, for example, one of the earliest sort of sources of law, still considered one of the base plates of the civil law, which is used in continental Europe, says things such as, if a burglar invades your home and you kill them, it isn't murder. So you are not authorized to kill that person, but if you do kill them, it's not something you would be punished for. I mean, just on a conceptual basis, what's your reflections on that?
I guess it goes to a principle of what you or one considers a reasonable defence. I'd probably draw a distinction between a threat to my life and a threat to my property. I think more extreme force is justified in the first case than the second. The law exists for a reason to deal with. It's a separate argument whether you believe the law does or doesn't deal with crime effectively, but the law exists to deal with crime. And it's justifiable, totally justifiable, to act in defence of your property and yourself. But someone entering your home, I don't think justifies you to shoot them on sight, as it were.
Right. And so, of course, in this country, there would probably be a trial if such a thing happened, in order for a court to figure out what actually did happen and to conceptualise it as murder or manslaughter or self-defence or so on. Yeah, right. So it's not legally straightforward, of course. It's very fuzzy. Now, what about the laws of war? Now, this, of course, is controversial and very sadly has become a very pertinent topic of conversation in the modern world. But I'm interested in how they may have emerged, that states not only sort of considered how violence within their territories ought to be controlled, but also violence that could potentially spill outside of their territories, that in theory they had no particular jurisdiction over. So one of the earliest examples of a law of war was the Ordinance on the Government of the Army from Richard II, when his troops were invading Scotland. So it was England invading Scotland. And he forbade his troops, under threat of their own lives, from, say, sexual violence against non-combatants and from sacrilegious acts, so in other words, desecrating churches and things like that. Now, prior to that, there were injunctions for armies going out of control when they were, attacking. But this was still remarkably innovative to start actually imposing laws on the armed forces. Why do you suppose he did that? Now, obviously, we can get into the specifics of, Richard II and his kingdom and so on. But just sort of abstractly, why would any monarch constrain their armed forces in such a way? How could they possibly benefit from that?
I think the first way to look at it is what benefit does it have for the monarch, and I think certainly historically, when it was the monarch who was being represented in war, a well-behaved army or military force would, a well-behaved army would legitimise or not illegitimise the conflicts that the monarch and the state was trying to perpetuate. It's sort of a very formalised example of someone trying to take a moral high ground, which sounds weird in the context of war, but it seems to be a way that throughout history leaders have legitimised their action by saying, well, we're acting to defend our interests or advance our interests, one of which is potentially more justifiable than the other, but we're acting constrained in such a way that we are avoiding damaging innocent people or people who don't deserve it. I think it appeals to a principle of desert.
Yeah, and no doubt Richard was inspired partly by Christian theory on, not treating people with violence unless there was a specific justification for it. But yeah, I think that's right, that it can actually do you harm as an invading force if you don't have some restraint on your armed forces. But interestingly, the sorts of laws of war that we're perhaps more used to today, so the law of armed conflict and rules of engagement and things like that, are remarkably modern. I mean, take things like the Geneva Convention that was first set out in the 1860s by a man called Henri Dunant. He was a Swiss man. And it's why, incidentally, the international symbol for the Red Cross is an inverted Swiss flag, if you've ever spotted that detail. And he was an eyewitness of the Battle of Solferino, which had it was incredibly violent, and the violence was spilling out into the civilian community, and so he wanted there to be some regulations on how armies would conduct themselves when on manoeuvres. I suppose what I'm interested in is why you think this is a relatively modern phenomenon. Why take care over civilian populations now, whereas historically that would have not been considered necessary? To the extent that Roman armies used to salt the earth so that they couldn't even grow crops back again. The treatment of the innocent was savage in many instances in the past, but seems to be much more regulated today. I mean, is it just what we sort of vaguely term enlightenment? What do you think is going on?
I think the way that states interact with each other has changed. I think the rise of economic change has driven a lot of this. I'd like to hope that it was just that sort of we had become kinder people, but I think it's motivated by far more basic things than that. I think, well, for a start, I think there is an element of that people view, on the whole, I think it's fair to say people view people different from themselves, different countries, coming from different provenance, in a much kinder light than perhaps they did 200, 400,000, 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
We're a much more globally accepted society. It's probably no surprise that something like the Geneva Convention emerged around the time that industrialization took off and economic links between countries grew. Right. So countries were no longer functioning by themselves, or even, empires were starting to fall. Countries couldn't support themselves by themselves. They needed some international links and cooperation. I think there's an element of trying to protect those. You're not going to trade with someone who, in a war, for whatever reason, not only fought your army, but also stopped you being able to grow crops, or decimated any form of production, so that you were then left with a huge number of unemployed people, sick, ill, wounded civilians.
Right.
So I think a lot of it comes from the changing way that states interact in general.
I agree, and of course, just the ease of communication. So simply knowing what's going on, I think, changed people's minds. And that could perhaps go back to my earlier point about maybe human nature isn't instinctively dark and savage, that if we find out, if we shine a light on some of the excesses that have happened, people are appalled by it typically and want some regulation. So, it's also not coincidental that Dunant is noticing this Battle of Solferino and is able to communicate that more widely than would have been possible in the past. So there's a bit of a sort of case that sunlight is the best antiseptic. I suppose another aspect is death penalties. States can put to death their subjects and others for certain high crimes in some instances. The UK got rid of the death penalty in 1965 under the Prime Ministership of Jesus College's own Harold Wilson. Again, do you think that was enlightenment that was happening there? Because it was actually rather unpopular. The British public didn't want the death penalty to be scrapped. And indeed, there was quite a significant portion of the population would like to see it brought back. So is the state sort of acting against its citizens' interests in this regard?
I think there are two things to explore. There's the argument that's frequently made that if you that is perhaps more controversial, that if someone is simply put to death for a series of horrendous crimes they've committed, there's an argument to be made that they're actually getting away lightly with what they've done. Again, going back to that human nature thing, I don't think humans are dark and savage, and there's a lot of evidence to show that prisoners who've done some really awful things, who've lost their liberty for a long time, do in fact understand that, and feel dreadful remorse and experience all sorts of unusual psychological states as a result of what they've done. And there's a strong argument to be made that I get the punishment is living with the crime, not just getting away with it, doing something, thinking, well, it's a justification that has been recorded historically, as people be like, well, I know I'm going to be put to death for this, so it's worth it. And I think there's a strong interest that people lose their liberty, but don't get away without. I think a lot of victims would argue this, that or have argued this rather, that is rather unfair in a way, that if they have to live with the pain of losing someone for the rest of their life, or someone who's been who's still living but the victim of an awful attack has to live with the consequences of that for the rest of their life. But the perpetrator would not.
There's also an argument that it demeans the state. I mean, if we were to go back to Hammurabi's eye for an eye sort of situation, then the state is no better than a violent thug, presumably.
That was a second. I think there's a danger in two ways for the state. It brings the state down to the level of the person committing the crime or people committing the crime. I think it's also dangerous because death is, by its nature, quite a final act. Now, while it's uncommon, it's not impossible that someone not responsible to the extent that the courts decide or the police decide commits a crime. And the benefit of not putting someone to death is there's always, even the slimmest chance, that sort of true justice in a way can be served if someone's been wronged, wrongly imprisoned, or that can't be done if someone's put to death.
Right. It's also, I mean, just as a deterrence, there's no strong evidence that it works terribly well. So even if your attempt is to stop violent crimes, it doesn't appear to be very effective in that regard either. So, of course, we could also talk about armed police. So although the UK doesn't have the capacity to put to death its citizens after a court case any longer, it is possible under certain circumstances for the police to use lethal force, but it is remarkably uncommon in the UK. There have been some high-profile cases, such as Mark Duggan in 2011 and Chris Cabba more recently, where individuals have been shot by police and the police it's been recorded as an unlawful killing. In other countries, it's much more common for the police to be sort of almost paramilitary, to be armed permanently and to use lethal force more frequently. And the high-profile case of George Floyd in Minnesota springs to mind, but actually death by police is remarkably common in the United States and in some other countries. I mean, obviously there's various ways we can look at this, but how countries organise their policing is an interesting choice. In the UK, it's historically been that the police are civilian, so they wear civilian-looking uniforms and they're typically not armed to be capable of lethal force. Do you have any view on that? I mean, I suppose we could be quite self-congratulatory about that and maybe at risk of being self-congratulatory, but just tell me your views on that approach to policing more generally.
I think without wishing to be self-congratulatory to the United Kingdom, I think it sets the bar for escalation lower than if a police officer turns up with a gun. Because a police officer turning up, and there are lots of interviews with police officers overseas in routinely armed forces who say, they feel threatened, the solution to that is to draw their weapon. But that immediately escalates any situation into a gunfight. Without, maybe it would be justified, or maybe there'd be no difference at all if every avenue of de-escalation was exhausted. But there's loads of evidence to suggest that police don't do that, either because they are often justifiably terrified, or because training's been insufficient. This came up in the US quite a few times. I think there's a cultural acceptance in some countries, like a lot of European countries, where the primary police force is the military police, whether it's the gendarmerie in France or that you've got similar situations in a lot of Western Europe. And they're routinely armed, but the evidence there doesn't suggest there are a lot of killing or death by police.
No, indeed.
And so I think some of it's cultural. I think there's an argument that perhaps the UK would be no different if police officers had guns, if the context of crime was the same as in those countries. But yeah.
Well, that's a crucial point, that it is highly contextual. And of course, part of the reason that US police are typically armed is because there are far more firearms in civilian ownership in the US as a consequence of their Second Amendment rights to bear arms. Interestingly, in the UK, we also have a right to bear arms. It's the 7th article of the Bill of Rights of 1688. But it rather unhelpfully states that you have to be a Protestant and that it's subject to any laws from Parliament that counteract that right, which, of course, there have been many. So we do not have a right to bear arms any longer. Let's get back to James Bond. So James Bond would be an officer. He's not an agent. Agents would be foreign. He's an officer, so I don't know where that secret agent thing comes from. An officer of the Secret Intelligence Service, not MI6, but SIS typically is the correct nomenclature.
Well, secret officer doesn't have the same.
It's a bit more bureaucratic, isn't it?
Yeah.
So he would be given instructions by C, not M. It's another sort of confusing thing about the universe that they get wrong. And Sir Richard Dearlove, who I think you might agree with me is one of the best spy master names ever, but he's a real spy master. He was C of SIS. And he claimed that he was not aware of an authorised licence to kill by one of his officers on a mission overseas. But this is despite the fact that there is a law called the Intelligence Services Act of 1994, which does permit under Section 7 for officers to break laws in other countries. And it's written vaguely enough that could include murder. But he pointed out what is, I suppose, fairly obvious, that if you do commit murder overseas and you get caught, there's nothing the British government can do. It's faintly absurd for the British government to write a law saying, oh, well, you're not going to be convicted of murder for something that you do in a foreign country, but if you're caught in that foreign country, then you're stuffed. I mean, it seems almost a slightly perverse thing to have written down. What do you think?
I think fundamentally the role of a government, particularly a government that presents itself as a liberal democracy upholding the rule of law, would be in no position whatsoever, and then under international law also would be in no position whatsoever to sort of write in and say, well, we said it was okay.
Yeah, right.
There'd also be a huge operational risk there. For the government to be seen to be admitting to sending someone to do something like that. I think it's an interesting question to consider because we also have the special forces.
Yes, indeed.
Are military, more openly part of the military, but go and conduct secret operations where they are subject to rules of engagement.
Yes.
But these secret operations are shrouded in such a way that
indeed.
And lots of people have speculated over time that, have they been acting in line with these or otherwise? And it's not just Britain that is in this position.
And then you're relying on whistleblowers, usually from within those units. So someone like Eddie Gallagher, who was a Navy SEAL, was convicted of war crimes as a consequence of his behaviour because his own SEAL team turned on him. You're right. So again, going back to secrecy being a big problem here with what we actually determine is the truth of these matters. There's a more recent piece of legislation from the UK which I'd be interested for your thoughts on, and this is more for internal matters. So this would be for the security service, so MI5, but also actually other internal law enforcement, including even HMRC. It's called the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Act, and this authorises agencies like the security services to break laws, to commit crimes, provided that they are gathering human intelligence. And this was to deal with some controversial cases where people who had been undercover for the police had been conducting romantic affairs with people. They had been integrating into various sort of social movements and were breaking laws. And this was basically to authorise all of that behaviour. So I suppose on the one hand you could say, well, good, at least they're bringing it out into the open and now they are legally authorised to do it, and they were going to do it anyway. The other way to look at it is that it's the state sort of sanctioning bad behaviour that otherwise they would criminalise. I mean, do you have a view on that?
I guess my view depends on the case's need for...
It's very contingent, isn't it? Yeah.
Security or national security, or if you're going to save a lot of lives, if you're going to keep a lot of drugs off the street,
sure.
Then there was a relatively recent case about frauds perpetuated in a sort of an affair and integration into some sort of criminal group. But there was also the counterpoint to that. In that case, there was evidence that sort of the intelligence gathered was managing to keep, I think it was keeping drugs off the street.
Right.
I think it's state-sanctioned law-breaking, yes. But if laws are changed themselves at the whim of the needs of a government or the wants of a government, I think it's not unheard of to say laws also are at the whim of the need for them themselves. And perhaps in a sort of a case where there's going to be a huge payoff from someone integrating themselves somewhere and breaking a law, then perhaps that's a necessary... I'm not saying that it's necessarily good, but
sure.
Perhaps it's necessary to...
Necessary evil.
Yeah.
No, indeed. I suppose the fear, as ever with law, is that all it takes is an unscrupulous implementation of that law for it to go horribly wrong. You know, you can imagine a government winning power that decides to use these tactics on its enemies within, say, the media or other political parties rather than violent drug gangs, as you set out. Anyway, hopefully quite an interesting conversation about whether or not a real James Bond would have a license to kill. I mean, strictly speaking, according to UK law, the answer is yes, they would. But it's also slightly mischievous and pointless to give an SIS operative a license to kill if they are going to be in a foreign jurisdiction. So kind of pointless. But anyway, interesting, I hope, nonetheless. Thank you ever so much, Angus. I found that really interesting. Let us know what you think in the comments, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you next time on the What, Why, When podcast. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.